The 54th regular session of the United Nations Human Rights Council commenced in Geneva today. During the session, the report on the human rights status in Sri Lanka prepared by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights was taken up for review.
The international community, including international financial institutions, should keep supporting Sri Lanka in its recovery in line with obligations around international cooperation and assistance by providing the fiscal space needed while pressing for genuine progress in governance, transparency and accountability. The economic hardship, the tensions around economic and structural reform policies and the delay of local elections continue to give rise to protests. The report provides an analysis of concerns with some forthcoming legislation, in particular the proposed anti-terrorism bill that will replace the Prevention of Terrorism Act and the new law to regulate media broadcasting. It urges a moratorium on the use of the PTA in the meantime and for the review of long-standing PTA cases to be expedited. The report recognizes the initiatives of the government to advance reconciliation, including its proposal for a new truth-seeking mechanism. However, it also stresses that urgent confidence-building steps are needed to create an environment in which a genuine reconciliation and transitional justice processes can succeed. The report recommends that the government accelerate investigations and prosecutions in emblematic cases of human rights violations, including the Easter Sunday bombings, in compliance with international human rights standards. The High Commissioner has repeatedly recommended that the government of Sri Lanka should establish a follow-up, independent and transparent investigation into the Easter Sunday attacks with international assistance and the full participation of victims and their representatives.
Following the remarks of the UN Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, Sri Lanka's permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva, Himali Arunathilaka, expressed Sri Lankan government's objection to the report.
The government of Sri Lanka has consistently rejected resolutions 46/1 and 51/1 that led to the setting up of the so-called accountability project. We also reject the written update, its conclusions and recommendations. We recall that the majority of member states either opposed or abstained from voting on these resolutions in fundamental disagreement with their unacceptable content, in particular the so-called evidence-gathering mechanism, the establishment of which is unprecedented. We reiterate that it goes beyond the mandate that member states conferred on the Council by UNGA Resolution 60/251. These resolutions are intrusive and polarizing and upheld only by a handful of countries for reasons unrelated to human rights and based on their vote bank domestic politics. Therefore, Sri Lanka will not cooperate with it. However, as an active participant of the multilateral framework and in keeping with our close engagement with the international community and the Council in other areas of its work, Sri Lanka will continue to engage constructively with other mechanisms of the Council that have been productive and beneficial to our people, such as the UPR process. The content of the written update does not reflect the actual situation in Sri Lanka. The economic, social and financial stabilization Sri Lanka has achieved in the past year has been appreciated and acknowledged domestically and externally. Those who are mandated and have the expertise to deal with economic and financial reforms remain confident in the country's prospects. It is also regrettable that the OHCHR has chosen to ignore the democratic resilience of the country and its institutions.
Later, country representatives expressed their views on the report on Sri Lanka prepared by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
We take note of plans for reconciliation mechanisms and the President's dialogue with Tamil political parties, as well as the promise to stop land acquisitions for archaeological, forestry or security purposes. However, these still need to be turned into concrete actions. We call upon Sri Lanka to suspend the Prevention of Terrorism Act.
We note preparations for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and emphasise the importance of an inclusive participatory process in the establishment of any mechanisms to advance transitional justice, to gain the confidence of all affected communities in line with international best practices. As Sri Lanka takes forward its economic recovery, we stress the importance of effective governance reforms and note the recent anti-corruption legislation. This must be accompanied by safeguarding established independent institutions and democratic processes.
We recognize Sri Lanka's strengthened reforms, including anti-corruption legislation. We remain concerned about tensions at religious sites and minority communities and the absence of local elections since 2018. We encourage meaningful consultations in finalizing the Anti-Terrorism Act and hope these discussions help bring the law into alignment with international best practices.
Canada continues to stress the importance of inclusive transitional justice that includes a focus on accountability for human rights violations, an end to impunity, and a commitment to reconciliation. We acknowledge that Sri Lanka is developing legislation to replace the PTA and urge Sri Lanka to ensure the legislation is consistent with its international human rights commitments. Canada remains concerned that relevant sections of the Penal Code unjustly target same-sex couples and calls on Sri Lanka to repeal these harmful sections.